We're here on Daf Hey and Aleph, and we started the Mishnah at the beginning of the second parak yesterday, and we'll continue today. At the end of the third line of the Mishnah, Bnei Ha'ir Sheshalchu es Shekleihem. So the Shekalim were collected in the various cities and communities of Israel, and they sent the Shekalim in the hands of messengers of Shlichim back to Yerushalayim. And on the way, Nignevu Osha Avdu. The Shekalim were either stolen from the hands of the messengers of the Shluchim, or Avdu, or they were lost. And it's going to depend upon whether their status is a Shomer Chinam, Shomer Sachar. And now the question is, who is going to be the Tovea? Who is the plaintiff? Is it Hegdesh, represented by the Gizbar? Or is it the townspeople? They have a claim against the messengers for losing their shkolim. And they can force the hands of the shluchim to take a shvuah that they did their utmost, they fulfilled their obligation of shmirah, they did not pocket the money, Eina Bershuso, Nensu, whatever shvuah they'll take to exempt themselves. And that shvuah, to whom do they owe that shvuah? Who's the plaintiff that demands and requires that shvuah? Is it the Gizbar representing Hegdesh, or is it the townspeople representing themselves? And this is contingent, this depends upon another question. In the case of the loss of the shkolim, do the townspeople have to replace those shkolim? Are they still obligated? Do we say that, well, their money's never reached the goal, and therefore they, no fault of their own, but the monies never were received in the lishka, therefore they have to replace that money, and the one who caused them to lose an extra shekel from their pocket is this shliach. Therefore, they have a claim as a plaintiff, as a toveh against the shliach. Shliach would have to take a shvuah to the townspeople because their money is at stake. They'll take the loss. They have to replace the shkolim if it didn't get received by the lishka. It was stolen on the way. Or should we say no? The townspeople are off the hook. They already contributed their Masechet Shekel. The Gizbar took the Masechet Shekel on behalf of the Hegdesh. It's Hegdesh who's going to suffer the loss in event that these shkolim are stolen or lost. Therefore, the Gizbar representing Hegdesh, he's the Tovea, he's the plaintiff, and the Shomer, the Shliach, has to take a shvuah to the Gizbar. So the Mishnah says the following: Im nitrama truma nishbaim legizbarin, im lav nishbaim lebnei ha'ir ubnei ha'ir shoklim tachteha. So whether or not the loss here is going to be suffered by Hegdesh, by the Gizbar, or by the Balabatim, it depends whether kvar nitrama hatruma or lo nitrama hatruma, which means that the truma, the shkolim that are collected, have to be placed in the shofros that we mentioned earlier, those boxes that were narrow on top and wide on the bottom. You remember we discussed those 13 boxes. And from those boxes, after the completion of the collection, the monies were transferred over to the lishka, to the Trumas al-Lishka. Now, at what point do we consider it as if the monies were already delivered, which is called nitrama hatruma, such that now the balabatim are off the hook, they fulfilled their obligation, and it's Hegdesh that's going to suffer the loss. At the moment of nitrama hatruma, the balabatim are alleviated of their responsibility, they fulfilled their obligation, they would not have to replace each shkolim with a second set of shkolim, and Hegdish will set for the laws. That's what the Mishnah is establishing, and that's called Farnitruma Hatruma. So that once the monies were received, they were collected in the shofros, in the various boxes. At that point in time, the Balabatim are off the hook. Now, wait a second. There's something very confusing about this Mishnah. The Shluchim were on their way to Yerushalayim. They show up in Yerushalayim and they're empty-handed. The money was stolen en route, or it was lost en route. So how can the Mishnah talk about Nitrama Truma? And the answer has to be, if you're following my logic, that Nitrama Truma is not a description of the Shekalim. The Shekalim never made it to their destination. They never reached the Shofros, and certainly not the Trumas, not the Lishka. But rather, Nitrama Truma refers to the Truma in general, not the specific Shekalim that was sent on the way from Haifa to Yerushalayim. And Nitrama Truma means once the collection of the Shekalim, the general collection, and the Shekalim in general have been received and placed into the Shofros, and now the last stage in this operation is to transfer the money from the Shofros over to the Lichka. That's called Nitrama Truma. But then you'll ask me, but wait a second. Okay, fine. Back in Yerushalayim, Nitrama Truma, the Truma was already collected. It's on its way to the Lichka. Why should that have any impact on the townspeople in the outlying communities whose Shekalim never made it to Yerushalayim? The Shekalim were stolen or lost on the way to Yerushalayim. Why does Nitrama Truma impact on those Balabatim in the cities of Israel that sent their Shekalim on the way? The Nitrama Truma in Yerushalayim relates to those Shekalim that were already collected, whereas the monies that are being sent have not been received. They haven't been collected. So why should Nitrama Truma relieve the Balabatim of their responsibility? And apparently, there's something magical going on over here. I have no other way of describing it. And that is that Nitrama Truma in Yerushalayim has an impact on the status of the monies that are collected by the Gizbar all over Israel. So there are two things going on over here in the physical reality. One thing that's going on is that the collection of the Shekalim reached the point where the shofros, the receptacles, were full. And at that point, the monies are being transferred over to the Lishka. And that happens, of course, in the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gizbar in Haifa is collecting the Shekalim from the various Balabat. And there's a relationship between these two events. The moment that the Lishka is now receiving the Shekalim in Yerushalayim, the Shekalim that were collected up until this date in the Shofros, at that moment, the Gizbar in Haifa, standing as the representative of Hegdesh, effectuates a kinyan. He is zoche in the Shekalim on behalf of Hegdesh. And that's what the Mishnah is telling me. A fantastical kiddush over here. Now, you would have said, well, if the Shekalim that was sent by, we'll call him Ruvain, in Haifa never reached the Mikdash, then he is still on the hook, so to speak. He is still on the firing line. He has not fulfilled his obligation. All right, we're not going to ask him to take a donkey and ride it all the way to Yerushalayim to personally deliver the shkolim. But until the shkolim are received, he has not fulfilled his obligation. That's just the reality of it. And therefore, any loss or theft is going to put him back in the driver's seat. He now has to be, he's chayav to pay and deliver the shkolim. That's what we would have said if not for the Mishnah name. The Mishnah is mechadish that if it's already nitrama truma, something that takes place in Yerushalayim in the Beis Hamikdash, then the gizbar here and all the gizbarim, all the representatives of Hegdesh, the administrators, we'll call them, all over Israel, now receive shkolim, and representing Hegdesh, they make a kinyan and a zchus in the shkolim. Any loss of shkolim subsequent to that moment in time of nitrama truma is the loss of Hegdesh. Why? Because Hegdesh was already zocha wherever they are, anywhere in the state of Israel. It's an amazing halacha. And therefore, nishbarim legizbarim. If nitrama truma in Yerushalayim, the gizbarim at the moment that they receive the shkolim in Haifa, for example, they are kona, they are zocha on behalf of Hegdesh. Any loss of these shkolim subsequent to that moment of nitrama truma is the loss of Hegdesh, and therefore the gizbar is now representing Hegdesh in the plaintiff's seat. He's the tovea, and now the shomer, the shliach, has to take a shvua to the gizbar. But lo nitrama truma, until that moment in time, the monies are now being deposited in the hands of the gizbar. The gizbar is, in a sense, only a safe deposit box. The mitzvah of shkolim has not been fulfilled yet. The zchiyah and the acquisition, the kinyan of Hegdesh has not been effectuated. And if there's any loss at this moment in time to the shkolim, then the balabatim and all the makomo shiyu, they are responsible to replace the shkolim. Therefore, if the shkolim are lost on the way to Yerushalayim and the balabatim are going to now have to dig into their pocket, they suffer the loss, and they will have to replace the shkolim. They now become the plaintiff. They will sue the shomer, shliach, and the shliach will take a shvua to the bnei ha'ir. Nishboin lebnei ha'ir. Ubnei ha'ir shoklim tachtei. Because if it's a case of lo nitrama truma, then the bnei ha'ir have not yet fulfilled their obligation. The shkolim are in transit, but they haven't yet been received, and they'll have to replace those shkolim when lost. They suffer the loss. They will be tovea, and they will demand the shvua on shvua of the shliach on their behalf. Now, there are a number of nafkaminas that we can think about. For example, the bnei ha'ir can decide to waive the shvua. For example, if you're my shomer and the object is lost, if I trust you, I can waive the shvua. There's no absolute requirement that you have to take the shvua. If I'm in toveh the shvua, so the bnei ha'ir in the case of lo nitrama trumasam would be able to waive the shvua. Not so in the case of nitrama trumasam. The gizbar is not endowed with the power of being mochel on the shvua. The shvua must be taken. Another nafkamina would be ein nishbon el b'fnei bal davar. Shvua is only valid if taken in front of the plaintiff. So who is the plaintiff that would have to be there present at the time of the shvua? If it's nitrama trumasam, it would be the gizbar. If it's lo nitrama trumasam, it would be the bnei ha'ir. The Mishnah continues. Nimtzu, we found the lost shkolim. In the meantime, the bnei ha'ir, in the case of lo nitrama trumasam, replaced the shekel with a second shekel. Oh, chechzirim aganovim. We caught the thief, or he came up on his own initiative and he did tshuva. We have the shkolim now, the first set of shkolim. Elu v'elu v'shkolim. The Bnei Ha'ir did not have a right to say, you know what? We fulfilled our mitzvah, which is the first set of shkolim. We were not obligated in the second set of shkolim. The second set of shkolim have to be replaced, returned to us. No. Elu ve'elu shkolim. There's halacha of hegdish. When a person donates and contributes to the Beis Hamikdash, it is hegdish. And once it's hegdish, it remains hegdish. Okay, 1 second. It remains hegdish. Fine, but give me credit. I gave you twice a shekel. Can't that be credited to me for next year? The ein olam lahem l'shana haba. The halacha is that every year is a separate entity as far as contributing the shekel is concerned. One maisa nesina, one shekel, could not be ola for another year. We have similar halachos, for example, in Maser. Right? You can't give Maser on this year's fruits from last year's fruits. Every year is a separate entity, a separate unit. Now, the replacement shkolim are hegdesh. What do we do with them? The first set of shkolim, which we now relocated, they have to be delivered to the Lishkas Trumas HaLishka for the purpose of buying Karbanos Tzibur. What about the second set of shkolim? All right, the hegdish. For what purpose? We have to earmark them for something, maybe as we discussed yesterday, for the building of roads in the various cities. But l'chor, it's not for Karbanos Tzibur. Because if Reuven already gave his shekel, and we have it now, we finally located the second shekel that Reuven gave to replace the first one, is hegdesh, but it's not shkolim. It's not earmarked and dedicated for the Karbanos Hatzibur. So that's going to be a sugya in the Gemara. What do we do with the second round of shkolim that have the status of hegdesh? This Mishnah is very reminiscent of what we learned in Masechet Shekalim. A man designates a lamb for the Korban Pesach, and it gets lost. And then he replaces it with a second lamb. In the meantime, he locates the first lamb. The second one has a new din. It's not a Korban Pesach. It was only designated as such in event that we won't be able to find the first Pesach, and therefore the second Pesach becomes shlom. And here too, by process of analogy, I would say that the second set of shkolim is not shkolim, it's hegdesh. Again, it can't be shlomim, but it's hegdesh. Okay. Now, the Mishnah tells us that when the Gizbar collects the shkolim all over, every Gizbar in his town, and these are small coins, it's very difficult to guard them. You know, if you have a small hole in a sack or in your pocket, you know, they fall. It's also a massive volume of metal that you have to transport to Yerushalayim. The Mishnah gave a special leniency, if you recall, as we saw yesterday, of conversion. You can convert smaller coins into larger coins. So, for example, you have coins of nechoshes, of copper. A whole bunch of coins of copper will get you one larger coin of gold, and you're allowed to make that exchange. So the Gemara asks, V'yasu oson margolios. If you want to find a way of easing the burden of transportation, then buy pearls. A whole bunch of shkolim, a whole sack of shkolim will get you one pearl. 1,000 shkolim will get you a necklace of pearls. So you take the necklace. I don't know if the Gizbar is going to want to wear the necklace. I don't know, but it's much easier to transport pearls. Gold coins are still heavy coins. A pearl is valued at Hon Tafot. Why not do that? And the Gemara answers Shemet Tezil or Tazil Hamargolios V'Nimtza Hegdesh Mafsid. Now I'll translate this Gemara, but the truth is I only understand this Gemara because I learned a little of Perikas Zav in Bab Metzia. I learned it with Rav Moshe Chorsky Zichron Levrach. The Gemara is telling us that the value of pearls on the market, you have to ask the jewelers, I think this is even true in contemporary time, fluctuates. It goes up and it goes down. If we're going to convert the shekalim into margolios, and those pearls will go down, they'll be devaluated, deflated in the market, then Hegdish is going to take that loss. Why? Because the Balabayas, when he contributed his shekalim, he fulfilled his obligation. Hegdish took the option, the prerogative, of converting it into pearls. Now Hegdish has to suffer the loss in the event that these pearls go down. So I didn't understand this Gemara because I thought, so what are you doing? You're telling me to convert my shekalim, the Hegdish, into gold, large gold coins? Gold could fluctuate in value. So the only answer I have is a Gemara in Azav. The Gemara in Azav says that when you make an exchange, a barter between two objects of value, then you can use what's called a kinyan suda. And then the Gemara says that a matbea cannot be used as a kinyan suda. So the Gemara wants to know, what happens if I switch silver and gold? Let's say I have silver coins, you have gold coins. And the Gemara says that gold is a commodity. It's not a coin. It's not a currency. It is a currency. Nobody denies that. But it also has inherent value, and that value is steady. It's reliable, meaning all the other metallic coins will fluctuate in value vis-a-vis the gold, but the gold is objective. And therefore, if I take that Gemara in Bab Metzia and I plug it in here, I come to the conclusion that from the perspective of Hefsed Hegdesh, because of devaluation, there's no great vulnerability or danger if we take coins like shekalim and convert them into gold currency, because gold currency is considered in halacha steady, reliable, steadfast, unchangeable. It's a set value and it's always reliable. And the Gemara now proves this point, that we're afraid of devaluation of pearls, of jewelry. Kahidus nan taman, we have a Mishnah in Bechoros. And the Mishnah in Bechoros is analyzing the regulations that govern pidyon in the case of a Bechor. And V'kulan, whether it's Bechor or Hegdish itself, niftin bekesef. Okay, kesef I understand. Ubeshava kesef. Shava kesef is metaltalin. And the Torah tells us that shava kesef ki kesef. And therefore metaltalin, which means small movable commodities, can be used for redeeming Hegdish and Bechor. Chutz mishkal. The Mishnah in Bechoros establishes that with regard to shekalim, if you want to redeem shekalim, you can only do it with currency, with matbeos, but not with commodities. Neither with with Shava Kesef nor with Margolios. And now you could ask me a question, V'ain Poda Mikalim. Why can't it be Poda Shkolim with Kalim? After all, we have a principle called Shava Kesef Kekesef. And we applied that in the case of Pidyon of Bechar and Pidyon of Hegdish. Let's apply it to the case of Shkolim as well. Of Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak Shema Yazel HaKelim V'nimtza Hegdish Mafsid. Rav Shmuel said that you cannot convert Shkolim, the Gizbarim do not have the license to convert Shkolim into Metaltalin, because these Kalim might go down in value. Inami, the Gemara says it's logical to make the analogy and apply it here with regard to Margolios. Shematazil, Margolios v'nimta hektesh mafsid. To the same extent that any commodity could devaluate, so too jewels and pearls might devaluate, and then Hegdesh has to suffer the loss. We're not going to allow it. Okay. Now the Mishnah established that not only were there shofros, these receptacles in the Beis HaMikdash to collect the shkolim, but even in Medina, across the entire country, they would place the shkolim that they collected into shofros. Masnisa, our Mishnah, that assumes that there were shofros in Medina. Okay, let's just take a break for a moment, a little background information. In the Beis HaMikdash, the shofros could be classified in two classes, in two categories. There's this year's shkolim, meaning shkolim that were collected that can be used this year to purchase karbonos tzibur, and there's shkolim that were collected past the deadline, and the monies can no longer be used to buy karbonos tzibur. Now, what are the deadlines? There are three deadlines. There's Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. So, in an ideal situation, a person should make sure that his shkolim are received before Pesach. That gives Hegdesh full use of the shkolim. If he didn't make it on time for that deadline, he still has another deadline of Shavuos. Any shkolim that came into the lishka between Pesach and Shavuos would still be used to purchase karbonos tzibur. And then there's even a third deadline. He didn't make it by Shavuos. We give him all the way up till Sukkot. And any monies that came in, shkolim monies, before Sukkot would still be used for that year's karbonos tzibur. But if he missed the final deadline, not A, not B, not C, and he brings his shkolim after Sukkot, you have to keep in mind that even if he didn't bring his shkolim on time, he's still obligated the mix of shkolim. But those shkolim that came after the deadline, the last of the three deadlines, meaning Sukkot, cannot be used to purchase karbonos tzibur. They were put in a special shofar, which is called taklin atikin. Atikin meaning old. There's taklin chadatin and taklin atikin. So the taklin chadatin, the new taklin, means up into but not beyond Sukkot. After Sukkot, they were placed in a different shofar, and that's called, designated as taklin atikin, which could not be used for the karbonos tzibur. In the Mikdash, this was critical. But our Mishnah says that in Medina, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, the collection was exclusively taklin chadatin. There would be no collection whatsoever after post Sukkot. There was no other shofar for the deposit of shkolim atikin. You missed the deadline, my friend. catch the next donkey ride to Jerusalem. You have a personal responsibility, meaning you must deliver your shkalim personally to the Beis Hamikdash. It's not going to be anyone there to help you. The Gizbar is not going to collect your shkalim and place them into Taklin Atikin. There is no shofar of Taklin Atikin. That's what it says here in Agamara. Masniso v'taklin chadatin avol taklin atikin lo b'da. Lo b'da apparently is a common phrase in Yerushalmi. Lo b'da means it's not included in this din, meaning there's no din of shofars in Medina for last year's shkalim. Last year meaning anything that came after Sukkot. You have a chov. You have an outstanding financial obligation to the Mikdash. Find a way of fulfilling it. But the Gizbar is not going to do that on your behalf. The Tani Kana, we found that way in a Brisa. Atikim b'Mikdash ve'ein atikim b'Medina. Even though our Mishnah says that we set up shofars in Medina, but that's only for Chadatin, but not for Atikim. Okay. Now we get to the main sugya for today.